Right. Okay. This is our last little bit of Matthew chapter 9. But before we get rolling, we'll just do a little bit of a review of these chapters. So that will take a couple of slides. But this is just mainly about Jesus' demonstration of his authority, because he taught with authority in the Sermon on the Mount. It says there in the last uh, verse, a couple of verses there, Matthew chapter 7. And so it was when Jesus ended these sayings that people were astonished at his teaching, for he taught them as one having authority and not as the scribes. And so basically what we're doing today is to then look just at the past here just for a couple of minutes, and then look at these last couple of verses. So there was the first set of three miracles. That was in Matthew chapter 8, and that was the healing of the leper, and the healing of the centurion's servant, and the healing of Peter's mother-in-law. So we saw there just Jesus having authority over not only physical issues, but Lord, that he had authority in the word, because in the healing of the centurion's servant, the centurion says, Lord, just speak a word and my servant will be healed. And when he healed the leper, that was about having authority over things that man really could not change. And the healing of Peter's mother-in-law was about having authority even within family contexts, and Jesus being interested in not just an individual, but an individual's family. So then there was the fulfillment of the mission and the cost of discipleship. And that's where you had those couple of men that were basically saying, Jesus, I'll follow you wherever you go. And Jesus said to him, foxes have holes and birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. And others were saying, let me first go bury my father. But Jesus said to him, follow me and let the dead bury their own dead. So it was basically Jesus saying, look, if you're going to follow me, follow me. Don't let various sorts of excuses get in the way. But so then there was the second set of three miracles, and that was the crossing of the sea, and that was a demonstration of Christ's not only authority in the word and the authority over physical dynamics, but also over spiritual things, because it says that he said to the sea, be in the storm, be still and be calm. So obviously there was a spiritual force and a dimension that was there, not seen by the disciples, but certainly seen by the Lord, that was demonic in nature, trying to upset the disciples and trying to upset the Lord. And Jesus demonstrated his authority over those things. And so then there was the deliverance of the demon-possessed men. And through all these, we did look at all the different stories and different ways the other gospels relayed these stories. So, and the deliverance of the demon-possessed men, that was a demonstration of Christ's authority over the spirit world. And then we had the healing and the forgiving of the paralytic, and that was Christ's authority over sin, because he says there, verse 6 of chapter 9, but that you may know that the Son of Man has power on earth to forgive sins, he said to the paralytic, arise, take up your bed, and go to your house. And he rose and departed to his house. So Jesus was demonstrating power and authority, not just showing that he was a miracle worker in that sense, but really what the driving force behind that was that the man's sins needed to be forgiven. just a bit of a little hay fever. And then we have the calling and questions after that in regard to the calling of Matthew as tax collector, and then there was issues in regard to fasting and the whole thing about no one puts on a piece of unshrunk cloth on an old garment, things of this nature. And then there was the third set of three miracles, and that was the healing of Jairus' daughter and the woman in the crowd that really were sort of clumped together as a miracle, albeit they were two very distinct things. And then there was the healing of the blind men, and then the thing that we looked at last week was the healing of the mute man, and how the Pharisees then really sort of put the final nail in the box, as it were, about the rejection of Jesus' authority by saying that he casts out demons by the ruler of demons. And so we then looked at the unpardonable sin, because a lot of that was tied into there. And then the thing that we'll be looking at today is really the result of true authority. As Jesus has done all these sorts of miracles, what is it then do we need to learn and then need to do? So we'll just look at this last bit here, which is Matthew chapter 9, verse 35 to 38. It says, when then Jesus went out about all the cities and villages, teaching in their synagogues, preaching the gospel of the kingdom, and healing every sickness and every disease among the people. And but when he saw the multitudes, he was moved with compassion for them, because they were weary and scattered like a sheep having no shepherd. Then he said to his disciples, the harvest truly is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Therefore, pray the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into his harvest. Now, this may be the end of chapter 9, but it logically, this might sound a bit sort of silly, but it logically then goes into chapter 10, because what Jesus is now doing here is he's basically has come to the end of his demonstration of authority, and now he's going to give authority to his disciples, and then they will go out in chapter 10 then and go and spread this gospel of the kingdom that Jesus has been talking about and demonstrating. So if you were going to divide the Bible up into chapters, I'm not sure if I would end chapter 9 right here. I may have actually started chapter 10 at this particular point, because it really is at these verses and then going into chapter 10 that is the next discourse, the next teaching that Jesus gives specifically to his disciples in regard to going out on this particular mission. But so what we're going to look at first in regard to this particular passage is we're going to look at what did Jesus see, because if I can just go back to that passage there, it says there in verse 36, but when he saw the multitudes, and I think, to me, that is the central thing to this particular passage. To me, when you read the Bible, there's always a central driving force, or there's a central statement. There's a word that the passage revolves around, and it may not necessarily be the beginning or the first verse, of a given passage. Pardon me. But it says there, but when he saw, and I think, even though the verse 35 is about, Jesus going out into cities and villages and teaching and preaching and all these sorts of things. This is really all a result of what he saw. And so that's why I have in this next slide is, what did Jesus see? So because he acts on what he sees, and the good pastor, as it were, and Jesus is the perfect pastor. He is the one that sees things and understands things clearly. So, but the first thing that he sees, as it were, as it says, and when Jesus went about all the cities and villages, teaching in their synagogues. Now, you teach people that are otherwise uninformed about a thing. So, because if somebody has already been taught something, that they're already informed about a thing, then they don't need to be informed about that. But these people have to be taught, so therefore they lack information, they lack knowledge, they lack wisdom. So I think one of the things that Jesus indeed saw with people was that they were ignorant. They were uninformed about the things of God. And so, and where he goes and does this is he says, went about all the cities and villages, teaching in their synagogues. And the synagogue was the main point at which teaching was done in regard to the Old Testament, the Word of God. Jesus' custom was always to be in the synagogue on a Saturday, which was the Sabbath, and to he would the attendant would give him a scroll. He would open the scroll and he would read from the scroll, and then he would sit and teach and inform the people as to what this particular passage means. And we know that when he was in Nazareth, that he read from Isaiah about how the deaf would hear, the blind would see, the gospel would be preached to the poor, and so on and so forth. And then he closed the scroll and said, "This has been fulfilled today in your hearing." And I mean, for those that were aware and understood those scriptures, that must have been just an incredible moment to hear somebody actually say that, in your hearing right now, this is being fulfilled. So scripture is very, very much alive and on the move there, and Jesus was the embodiment of that thing. So, but when he was looking at people, he saw them as ignorant, saw them as people that were uninformed. So, and then the next thing was, it says that the teaching in their synagogues, preaching the gospel of the kingdom. And one thing about what preaching does, which is different from teaching, teaching's primary goal is to instruct and inform and to bring a sense of knowledge and wisdom that makes a bit of sense. But people also need to be encouraged, and that's what preaching does. Preaching is a thing that stirs people up and motivates people, and so if people needed encouragement, that means that they lacked courage, which is to say that they were discouraged. Okay, so and I would imagine that the Jews back then in particular were in an environment that was very discouraging. They were under the rule of Romans, an outside force, people that weren't them, and imposing on them taxes, imposing on them customs, imposing on them in a lot of ways a language that was not like theirs. They spoke Hebrew and Aramaic, and what was being imposed on them was the likes of Greek, which read the opposite direction. There were those that knew Latin too, which was then a sort of a thing that went beyond Greek, and it was again a different alphabet, read the same direction as Greek, but its culture was going in a much different direction than the culture that they were used to. So there was a lot of discouragement, economically, discouragement politically, discouragement militarily. And so Jesus was then preaching, as it says here, the gospel of the kingdom. So this is good news of a benevolent kingdom, because the kingdom that they're operating in now and experiencing now is a malevolent kingdom. It's a kingdom that's against them. It's a kingdom that's bringing false gods to them. It's a kingdom that's economically is really biting into their income and all that kind of stuff. I mean, Matthew certainly would have known all about that, being a tax collector. So there was lots of things that were discouraging them, and so Jesus was looking at them and saying, they need encouragement, they need good news, and they need to know that there's a kingdom that is not of this earth, but a kingdom that is coming down from heaven, that will really bolster them up. So, and then there was the sick, and healing every sickness and every disease among the people. So you had uninformed people, you had discouraged people, and then you had people that were sick physically. And it's amazing how much sickness, even in this day and age, is related to stress. And I'm sure back then it was the same. You had a lot of, things that were organically driven by various sorts of diseases, and you had the likes of leprosy, you had blindness, you had lameness and deafness, and, all that sort of stuff. But people's guts were probably turned over in them, and there was probably a lot of different issues that people probably didn't necessarily talk about an awful lot, but it made them very, very ill. And so a lot of that sickness was demonstrations of a deeper problem of sin. Sin makes you blind. Sin makes it so you can't hear. Like with leprosy, the sin makes it so that you don't feel things any longer. So there's a lot of spiritual tie-in with the physicality of sickness. So it was all that. And then, as you get to the middle of the passage there, and it says, but when he saw the multitudes, and it's interesting that he, sees, everybody sort of collectively, and sees everybody as a group. It says he was moved with compassion because they were weary. And now somebody who is weary is somebody who is tired. And a lot of the people that I deal with in the my work and that kind of thing are people that are weary. They're sick and tired of being sick and tired, and they've just had the stuffings knocked out of them. It could be, because of bad choices and all that kind of stuff, or it could be because of living in a home with somebody who's knocked the stuffings out of them. So there's a lot of weariness even in the world today. And people back then were very, very, very tired, and just didn't have the get up and go. And a lot of it stemmed from bad information, misinformation, non-information, discouragement, and sickness. And then they were scattered. It says they were, because they were weary and scattered, and it's likened unto sheep having no shepherd. And but when I think about something, somebody that is scattered, I have a sense of disconnectedness, and it's like going into a foreign land and you don't know the language, you don't know the culture, you don't know, even if you knew the language and knew the culture, if you went to another town, you don't know the people there. You're a blow-in, and and then people look at you funny, and they go, you're not from around here because your accent is different. So when I went to Glasgow one time for a bit of orientation with Stars, I went to a drop-in with some sort of hard folk from drinkers and such from Glasgow, and but they were all in this drop-in getting a taste of soup and just a bit of social activity and so on, and some of our workers at the time were there and sharing the gospel and that kind of thing. So I was there just as part of my orientation to Stars. And so I remember, going around and, talking to people. And then as I was leaving, I just, said something to the effect of, look, I'm leaving now. Name's Woody. It's good to meet you. I'm an American. That's why I sound funny. And so then the guy I was talking to says, "Oh, actually, sure, you look funny too." So so he, all a bit of a joke, but it didn't really lend itself greatly to me being feeling like I was really part of things. So so there is a I think even in this world today there is a disconnectedness, and the pandemic has really lent itself to that. It has caused a lot of people to just feel very much at odds with their own social community, because you're having to stand 2 meters from people and you can't shake their hand. And I've met a few people from church recently here in the shop and that kind of thing, and it's great to see people, but you're obligated to be standing off, and that's all very strange, and so people back then, they were scattered, they were shifted about, and the Romans probably, the way they controlled people was said basically, okay, well, you're not living there, you're going to live somewhere else, or sold them into slavery or whatever, so families would have been broken up, and just that sheer disconnectedness. And then as Jesus is likened them to sheep without a shepherd, he basically is looking at people and saying they're directionless, so they just lack vision. They lack why am I getting up in the morning and all this kind of stuff. So so we have an awful lot of people here that are really pretty much down in the mouth here. It's they're uninformed, they need encouragement, they're sick, they're weary, they're scattered, and they are directionless. So but then we have, well, what did Jesus do with what he saw? And this is quite a big list of stuff here. So the first thing is that he went to them. Because it says in verse 35, then Jesus went about all the cities and villages. So so Jesus was very, very concerned about people, and so so it says that he went about and went to people. Jesus knew that people were uninformed. Jesus knew that they lacked encouragement, and really a lot of ways lacked ability to even come to him, as it were. So he went to them, and he taught them. He opened up the scriptures to them. Jesus' mode of teaching was out of the Bible. That's what he did. I would imagine that he took the word of God and just made it completely and utterly alive, and then when he taught the parables and taught various stories, even like when Jesus in Luke 15 was talking about the lost sheep and the lost coin and the lost son. We would read those and we would say, yep, okay, we know those well. But I'm sure Jesus, when he was teaching those things, was teaching those things with great excitement and great power, and people were just hanging on every word. I remember when I was in Portugal back in 1982, that was my first experience of doing mission work. There was a missionary there that uh, he could have an open air in the town square for 4 hours, and he had people hanging on every word, and it was an amazing thing to watch. And what he did is he used the one of the symbols of the Portuguese culture is the Portuguese rooster, the Portuguese cockerel, and very famous sort of symbol that they would use. And so, but what he did is he would take a very common broom, which was made, oftentimes just out of thin sticks, that were then tied in a bundle to the end of the shaft, and people would have used that to sweep up their yard or their floor or whatever. And what the guy did was he then took bits of stick that came out of an old broom, and he would carve out of it a Portuguese cockerel, and showed people how to do that. And people were just absolutely fascinated with how this guy was taking a little, where the two twigs would sort of split, in where it would fork, and he would just make this little chicken out of it. And but he used that to show the people how something so common and so just being used as a with a broom, that wasn't worth anything, how something of value could then be brought out of that. And so he was then, basically teaching that, God can take, as it were, common people that maybe don't think much of themselves, and God can make out of them something that is great. But it takes the skill of somebody that's outside themselves to actually do that. And so that's what this man did. And he had a sketchboard, and he showed people, and he taught people, and got people involved. And so so one of these meetings actually lasted about 4 hours, and so people were just absolutely enthralled with it. They're absolutely encapsulated with it. So I think, Jesus in a lot of ways, did the same thing. I don't think Jesus was a dull teacher, to say the least. So he had people on the edge of their seats. And then, because these people needed encouragement, he encouraged them, because it says there that he preached the gospel of the kingdom. That's good news, so we need encouraged. So that's, one thing that we hear in the news quite a lot is not really things that encourage us. We hear a lot of, if anything, discouragement. That tends to be what the news is about. Now, you do hear a couple of feel-good stories in regard to, there's that little boy that has 2 prosthetic legs, and apparently he's, walking some number of miles or whatever, and is raised over or near enough 1 million pounds or something of this nature. So they throw that on the news, and that encourages people and gets them, going and that kind of stuff. But it's rather short-lived. It's like, Major Tom and his 100 laps around his garden. That lasted for, what was it, April, and and the news was all running around it and visiting him, and he became a knight, and, he got a promotion to colonel and all these sorts of things, but you don't hear about Major Tom in the news anymore. It's good on him. He did a great thing. But Jesus, when he was going out there to teach and encourage, he was teaching and encouraging about things that were eternal, and things that would last forever. The gospel of the kingdom is an everlasting thing. And it says that he went about and healed. So healing every sickness and every disease among the people. So, could you imagine if, Jesus went to Craigavon Area Hospital, or he went up to the Royal, or he went to the Mater, or the City, or Dundonald, or Daisy Hill, or Downpatrick Hospital, Antrim Area Hospital, Alton Gelvin, or the Southwest Acute Hospital used to be there, and any of these hospitals in Northern Ireland, and a man came in and basically just emptied the place, because everybody got healed, because that's what it says here. It says healing every sickness, every disease among the people, So Jesus came in and demonstrated incredible authority, over sickness, and just emptied the hospitals basically, So in this day and age, with the pandemic and all that kind of thing, Jesus, if he came in this day, just waving his hand over a hospital and just saying that's it, everybody is healed, and everybody just, instantly felt better, So, but Jesus, as it says there in the next verse, when he saw the multitudes, he was moved with compassion. Now, anytime you see the word compassion in the New Testament, especially when it's connected with Jesus, is a very, very active word. It's a word where it's nearly like he's compelled to go out and do something. When he sees this, he's moved with compassion. He's moved, but because of people's plights, and he gets out there and he does a thing. But then what he does here is he makes a diagnosis, because Jesus is not just a haphazard individual. He's not just running around and reacting to need, because there's a pile of need. So he sees the multitudes, was moved with compassion because they were weary and scattered, like sheep having no shepherd. And then he said to the disciples, the harvest truly is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Therefore, pray the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into his harvest. So what Jesus does initially here is that he goes out and sees the need, and assesses it, looks at the detail of it, sees what the economic things are, see what the spiritual things are, see what the mental needs are of people, see the physical needs, and so on. But then he has to then diagnose what the actual problem is, and so he says, the harvest truly is plentiful. It's out there. It's ready to be brought in. People are in a position where they need these things, and this is what needs to be done. But there's a problem, and that is that the laborers are few. So there's not many people out there that actually go and address this. And then what he does is he prescribes a vision, because he says, because of this situation, and these are verses that are talked about in missionary conferences and all that kind of stuff. But this is stuff for everybody. It says, therefore, pray the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into his harvest. So the prescription is that you need to seek God about these things, and as a result of this, he then enlisted men, but the call had to go before the need, because you could be running around like a headless chicken and going, gosh, there's piles and piles of need out there, which there is, and you could go and spend an awful lot of energy doing, trying to meet this need, but it's so huge, and so we have to be called into this work. So and then but as I say here, the way forward needs to be God driven, not need driven, because if you are first need driven, and that's how you operate, you'll end up being very, very discouraged, because it's like a bottomless pit, and it's bottomless in terms of resource, bottomless in terms of money, all that kind of stuff. So, but if you are God driven, then you will go and get into this vision the way God wants you to. Because we're just going to look briefly then into chapter 10 here, just at the list of the disciples. But Jesus is looking at these things from a proper perspective. He's saying that the harvest truly is plentiful, but there's laborers that need to go out into this thing. Can't be done by one person. Can't be done by one man. And so there's only a few laborers, but we need more. So who do we talk to about these things? Well, we talk to God. We talk about the Lord of the harvest. He's the one that's in charge of these things, and he's the one that needs to organize how this is going to go out. So that's why it's God-driven, not need-driven. And so we'll look here just at these. At what Jesus does then in the first couple of verses of chapter 10. I know that we said we'll just do chapter 9, but just because there's obviously these two paragraphs are very, very much tied together. So, but what I want to do is just put up these verses here. It says, and this is the first 5 verses of chapter 10. It says, now when he had called his 12 disciples to him, he gave them power over unclean spirits to cast them out and to heal all kinds of sickness and all kinds of disease. Now the names of the 12 apostles are these: first Simon, who is called Peter, Andrew his brother, James the son of Zebedee and John his brother, Philip and Bartholomew, Thomas and Matthew the tax collector, James the son of Alphaeus and Lebbaeus, whose surname was Thaddeus, Simon the Canaanite, and Judas Iscariot, who also betrayed him. These 12 Jesus sent out and commanded them, and then Jesus goes on and commands them various things in regard to going to the house of Israel exclusively, not anywhere else. But the words that I have in blue there are the things that Jesus does. The first thing he does here is he calls these 12 men, and then he sends them out and he commands them. So you can see the order of this is that they're not just going out driven by a need, but they're going out because they have been called by Christ himself to go and do this work. And the word 12 sort of pops up a few times. So it's specific individuals. It's these 12 men. But how he refers to them first in the scriptures here in verse 1 is that when he had called his 12 disciples to him. Now, have that in green and underlined, because that's, first of all, a very important distinction, because disciples are people that learn, people that are under the tutelage of a person, of a master. And this master is the Lord Jesus Christ. And so because before you can be sent, you have to learn. You can't just, and this would be the case with any kind of operation or business of any sort, is, before people go out and do their job, they need to be trained. So, and that's, I think, where some people get things a bit backwards, is they go out and they react to a need that is out there and say, oh, I can do this. I can make a difference. Jesus is great. He's given me life, and I want to tell everybody. Well, that's good. But the thing is, are you called, to do whatever God is calling you to do? And but you have to learn. My first few years of being a Christian back in the 70s and early 80s was really about learning. I had to learn how to read the Bible. I had to learn how to pray. I had to learn that fellowship was important. I had to learn that having a witness was correct, but it had to be within my own locality, and being accountable and all these sorts of things. And then, it wasn't then long after that then there was, opportunity then to go out and put this into action. So I became a Christian in 1977, and so then 5 years after that, I went to Portugal to do mission work, and I believe that God called me to that, and God cemented then the call to full-time Christian work as a 16-year-old, in that particular avenue. Now, I didn't know where that calling would end up placing me. I thought I would be doing a variety of different things. I remember there was a time where I thought I was going to end up in South America, working for Wycliffe Bible translators and doing all kinds of things with regard to that. But I was then going to God with my resume or my CV, and saying, God, what do you think of this? I've got all this training now, and I want you to place me in such and such a place because I feel that that's what I can do for you. And God was going, well, no, because I haven't called you to this. I've been teaching you many things, but I haven't called you yet to go out and do a particular thing. And so then God taught me more, and then you get set. So and then I ended up here in Ireland. So and I was thinking that it's actually today, 28 years ago. Today was when I first landed in Dublin on a flight from out of New York City. So so that was 28 years ago. So today. So but I think it's just important that the way the 12 are referred to initially is disciples, and so it says he gave them power. So this is where Jesus gives them authority over unclean spirits, cast them out, heal all kinds of sickness and disease. But then he says there in verse 12, or the scriptures say, now the names of the 12 apostles are these. So if I'm correct here, I think this is the first time that the word apostles is used in Matthew, and it is, and the word apostle means to be sent with a specific mandate or specific message. So now there are people that would say, well, the only apostles were those who had a direct experience of the Lord Jesus Christ. So that would be these 12 men and Paul and other people. Matthias was the one who replaced Judas Iscariot as one of the 12 there in Acts. Really don't hear much about Matthias after that, but there is then in the scriptures the gift of apostleship. And and to me, if there are people then that are gifted with apostleship, well, then that's not just 12 men that have direct experience of Christ. That is, those are people that are sent very much by the Spirit of Christ to go and do certain things. So there would be a teaching out there or an understanding that apostleship in this day and age would be people that are going out as missionaries or ambassadors for Christ, whether it's local or even farther afield, but they're sent by God to do this work. So, but the names of these people, we're quite familiar with Peter, Andrew, James, and John. And then when it gets down to the other guys, we start to struggle a little bit in terms of remembering their names and who they are and what they are. We certainly know about Judas Iscariot because he was a bad pill, so he betrayed the Lord. So we know all about him as well. But there seems to be something about Peter, James, and John that were the sort of the inner circle of Christ. There's a much more discussion about them. They went up with Jesus up to the Mount of Transfiguration. They were brought into Jairus's, Mrs. Jairus and the daughter. They were the three that were brought in. And it sort of seems like the rest of these guys in some ways were maybe not quite as connected or something like that. But nonetheless, it says here that these are the 12 apostles, and they were sent out to do a specific work, because it says there in verse 5 that these 12 Jesus sent out and commanded them to go out and do this work. So, but I thought I'd just do a little bit of a review, or not a review, but just a quick little synopsis of who these guys are. But Peter, as it says there, Simon, who's called Peter, one of the early guys. If you look at the Gospel of John, chapter 1, it was Andrew, who was actually a disciple of John the Baptist, who told Peter about Jesus. So Simon was a very kind of impetuous sort of man. He was some people call him Peter was the man with the foot-shaped mouth, so he was always sticking his foot in it. But he was an affectionate man. He was a generous-hearted man. He was a born leader, as it were. And so he did have a business, so he led in his business, him and his brother. Andrew had the fishing business, and then they were kind of partners with James and John. They were, their dad's name was Zebedee, and so on. But Andrew was the man who I think was very personally interested in people, because he got alongside of the little lad who had the 5 loaves and 2 fish and that kind of stuff, and bringing Peter to Christ and all that kind of stuff. So here's a man that we don't read as much about, but yet has a very keen interest in people, and he was always bringing people to Jesus, So we can learn a lot from him. And then we have James and John, who were 2 brothers, just like Peter and Andrew. And James was the first of the apostles that was martyred there in the book of Acts, in Acts 12, by Herod. And in fact, all the disciples, apart from Judas and John, all died a martyr's death, at least either by tradition or in history. So Judas obviously committed suicide, but John died as a prisoner on the Isle of Patmos, whereas everybody else was killed for their faith. And then we have John, and he was the disciple whom Jesus loved, as it's described in the Gospel of John. And it's funny that the Gospel of John doesn't actually give a list of apostles. There's only 7 that are mentioned in the Gospel of John. There's lots of 7s in the Gospel of John. It's very, very interesting when you do a study on it, just seeing how many 7s of things there are. But there's only 7 disciples that are mentioned in the Gospel of John, whereas the Synoptic Gospels all have their various lists here. And then the verse 3 there about Philip and Bartholomew. Philip was the one who brought or told Bartholomew about Jesus. Now, Bartholomew is named as Nathaniel in the Gospel of John, so it's pretty much universally accepted that Bartholomew and Nathaniel are the same people. Philip was a guy that, again, he brought people to Jesus, but there were things that he sort of didn't quite, quite get. If you look farther in the Gospel of John, he was a bit confused about certain things. So, but Philip and Bartholomew seem to be sort of lumped together a bit. Now, Philip is not to be confused with Philip the Evangelist, that is in the Acts. That's a different Philip. Because that Philip was the one who went down to and saw the Ethiopian eunuch and told him about the scriptures and baptized him, all this stuff. So that's a different Philip. That's not the same Philip as the one in this particular list. So, and the Philip the Evangelist in the book of Acts was also a man who had 4 daughters who prophesied. But and then you have Thomas, who's known for his doubting, but then he says there in the Gospel of John, "My Lord and my God." So he's one that saw physical proof of the Lord, and he was a bit of a melancholy sort of guy, because in the Gospel of John, when Jesus says, "Let us go up to Lazarus," whom he was going to raise from the dead, Thomas says, "Well, we'll just go up and die with him as well." Sure. But Thomas thought, well, we're all gonna die here. So, and then you have Matthew here, and he labels himself in his own gospel as the tax collector. So he does sort of tie in with his past a little bit. Matthew's never in the other lists labeled as the tax collector, just as Matthew. But here in this particular gospel, he mentions what his background is. James, the son of Alphaeus, is there's only one bit in the Gospel of John, I think it is, where he. Sorry, that's not James, the son of Alphaeus. It's the one who's called. So there's very, very little known about James, the son of Alphaeus. But Lebbeus is also known as Judas, the son of James, so not to be confused with Judas Iscariot. But he's mentioned in the Gospel of John with one thing that he says, because it says, Judas, not Iscariot. But it's accepted that Lebbeus is also this man called Judas, son of Lebbeus. So, and then we have Simon the Canaanite, and that was Simon the Zealot, and he was him and Judas Iscariot were both card-carrying members of the Zealot group, and basically they were very kind of terrorist-minded sort of guys. But Simon the Zealot, as he is mentioned as such in the book of Luke, as a zealot, I think Jesus really loved getting alongside of him, because he was a man that was probably very driven by politics and driven by the cause, and and all this kind of stuff, and being very, very committed. But I think what Jesus did with Simon the Zealot was say, look, I love how you're committed to things and how you're driven by things, but let me tell you how you can be committed and driven by the things of God. So whereas Judas just didn't quite weigh in with that kind of thing. So but it's an interesting crowd because they're men of different temperament, different backgrounds, different abilities, and different gifting and all that kind of thing. But it just does demonstrate that Matthew, the disciples who then became apostles, despite their variance, they had one king, and they were given authority and sent out and commanded to go. So so that is really the kind of the sum total of these 2 chapters and a little bit of chapter 10, and we'll finish it up here. And like I say, next week we'll get into a little exercise out of a little bit of an exercise of um, talking about just Bible study and reading the Bible. I have a little PowerPoint about 2 Timothy 3:16, just to go through, and a few other little questions to ask when you're reading the scriptures and stuff like that. So, so we'll leave it at there.